and welcome to our webinar today, How to Ace the MBA Admissions Interview. My name is Nelly and I will be the moderator on behalf of My Prep team. I'm here today with Petia Whitmore. Petia is a former Dean of Graduate Admissions from Babson College, and over the years she has interviewed hundreds of MBA applicants. Petia is also the founder of My MBA Path and is now helping potential candidates to get into their dream business schools. So welcome, Petia. But before starting, I just want to let all of you that you can ask questions anytime during the webinar, just using the Q&A box. We'll take time to answer to all of them. All questions are welcome, so don't hesitate. I think everything is set now, so I'm giving the floor to you, Petia.
Great, thank you so much, Nelly, and hello and welcome everyone. We are going to be talking about one of my favorite topics in the MBA admission process, and it's the MBA admissions interview. As Nelly said, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. If they're relevant to the part of the presentation that we're currently covering, we'll cover them right away, and if not, we will get to them at the end. At the very end of the presentation, we'll definitely leave some room for questions. So you don't have to worry, you'll have the opportunity to have everything answered. That's the purpose of today's talk, to really leave you with enough information about the MBA admissions interview so that when you are hopefully invited, you can actually be prepared and really ace the MBA admissions interview. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what does it mean to get the coveted interview invite as part of your MBA application. What it means is that, first of all, you submitted your application to your dream program. Your application was reviewed and the school really liked you, because at the most selective programs, a fairly small percentage of candidates receives an interview invite. So the interview invite indicates that you are admissible. Your academics, your work experience, your examples of leadership, your essays, everything that you put together in your MBA application was found to be of good quality, to meet the criteria for the class that the admissions team is trying to put together, and they wanted to talk to you. It also means that your odds just went up. Usually at some of the most selective programs, at the top 25 programs, collectively, only about 25% of candidates get admitted. But when you get to the interview stage, usually programs invite 2, at most 3 candidates for every one spot in their class. So your odds just went up. You beat the competition, you impressed the admissions committee, and now they want to talk to you. What it also means is that you need to understand what really is the role of the interview in the MBA admissions process. And what it is, as I said, in the initial evaluation, your academics, your work experience, everything seemed to truly be competitive, to be compelling, to be desirable to that program. But what they want to assess is your interpersonal and communication skills and what kind of an addition you will be to that program's class, to that school. So what they're going to be looking for in the MBA admissions interview is how you come across, how you speak, how you communicate, how you give evidence of your performance, of what type of team player you're going to be. And all of this is going to be assessed to determine, are you indeed a fit for that school? And are you indeed the kind of person that they're looking for in for their programs? So let's talk a little bit about how do you strategize now that you've gotten the invitation, you're really excited, but all of a sudden the excitement kind of like wears off a little bit and you start to get nervous. This is what typically happens with candidates. All of a sudden it's like, now what? I'm going to be in the spotlight. What do I do? How do I actually end up being successful? So this is what you do. There are 2 parts to thinking about your interview that are really, really important and that will set you up for success. And those 2 parts are research and preparation. in essence, what we're doing today with this webinar, you're kind of doing your research right now because you're learning about the various types of admissions interviews, what role they serve, and it's part of what's going to help you when the time comes, hopefully later this fall, if you're applying in round 1 this year, or next spring, if you're applying in round 2. When it's time for you to actually have your interview, you will have already done some of your research. That's what we're doing today. And then preparation, we'll talk about that, what that includes, because there are certain steps that every candidate who wants to ace their interview and do really well and be of the 2 or 3 candidates who get invited to the interview stage, if you want to be the one that ends up walking away with an offer eventually, the preparation is what's going to get you there. So let's talk about all of this. First of all, there are several types of admissions interview, and let's talk a little bit about each one of them. Most MBA interviews are by invitation. As I was describing earlier, the admissions office is really reviewing your application, and they're trying to see if you're a fit or not. They're almost making, it's a little bit more of an evaluative decision, but it's still a decision on your candidacy. But a very small number of programs will actually allow you to self-initiate an interview. The University of Virginia, Darden, especially for their early decision round, is one notable school that has a window where anyone who's applying in that round can actually go on the school's website and schedule an interview as an indication of their interest, as a way for them to get in front of the admissions committee early on. Again, a very small number of schools, but it's important to know that it exists. And it's really important for you to research the schools that you are interested in to understand, do they offer this or not? In terms of the format of the interview, there are a couple of things that you need to know. The interview could be blind or it could be comprehensive. A blind interview means that the person who's interviewing you will not have read your entire application. They will most likely have a copy of your resume, but that will be the extent to which they will know your background. They're not going to know your test scores, your academics, what you wrote in your essays, and they will let you know that that's the case at the beginning of the interview, and even before the interview, you will be notified what to expect. The goal of an admissions office is not to trip you up, it's to actually help you be successful in the interview. So the blind interview will be mostly based on your resume and some other questions, of course, but again, it's not going to dig into certain parts of your application and the materials that you submitted. Unlike the comprehensive interview, where the person who's interviewing you, Harvard, for example, is very famous for conducting this type of interview. The person who's interviewing you will have read your application and they might dig and want to take a deep dive into things you said, examples you used. So it's important to know which one to expect. There's no necessarily advantage or disadvantage of one format or the other to you as a candidate. It's just important that you're prepared. So a word of advice here, regardless of whether your interview is blind or comprehensive, when it comes to preparation, one of the smartest things that you can do is to actually reread your entire application and make sure that you remember all of your examples, everything that you presented as part of your candidacy to the admissions office. Continuing with the format of the interviews could also be individual or group. The majority of MBA admissions interviews are individual. There's one person interviewing you, but a very small number of programs do group interviews. The Wharton School is a very notable example where their interview is done in a group setting, where a group of candidates typically has to discuss a case. So there's a certain logic and strategy behind that format where they're looking to not simply hear a candidate tell them what kind of team player and team leader they are, but to actually demonstrate and see this dynamic at play in a simulated case discussion. So again, it's important to know which one. If you end up being a person who is invited to an interview, that's a group interview. Again, preparation, being really aware of what are the components that go into successfully acing that type of interview is really important. And then in terms of, again, the types of interview, there's a standard behavioral interview, one that seeks to ask questions that have to do with learning about your past behaviors, because they're considered to be a really good predictor of your future ones. So think of a behavioral interview along the lines of, tell me about a time when you had to overcome a challenge at work, or tell me about a time when you weren't able to gain consensus from a group of individuals. So the interview seeks to understand how you approached such situations and what you did, and make some conclusions based on your answers and on the examples that you use about what is the pattern of your behavior, what kind of a professional are you. It's important to mention that there are many different options of who might conduct your MBA admissions interview. Let's see, we have a quick question. Let's see. Okay, we'll get to this at the end. So who will interview you? Your interview might be conducted by a person from the admissions office. This is a very typical thing. Some admissions offices do all of their interviews are conducted by recruiters or admissions staff. Some use a combination. And when a combination is used, the other participants might be alumni. It could be someone from your country, someone from your industry. There's sometimes a little bit of matching that happens there. Because they want to put in front of you a person who A, will understand your background, but B, will be able to establish rapport with you, right? And truly be able to dig into who you are, how you act, how you think, and provide a really valuable data point into your admissions decision. And then in many cases, admissions offices also employ current students, right? And there's a lot of logic behind that. Back during my days as Dean of Graduate Admissions at Babson, we used to use a large group of current students as interviewers because they were very often the best judges of to what extent someone will be a really good fit for the class, is their profile what we're looking for, and could they really see this person as their classmate, sitting next to them, working on a project with them. So current students are definitely a very valid and very valuable source of conducting admissions interviews. One thing that I'm very often asked by candidates that I work with is they hear that it's really important that they're interviewed by someone who's on the admissions committee, the so-called AdCom, and that unless you are, you kind of don't have the same opportunity to make a first impression, that perhaps your candidacy is not as strong if they're just having an alum or current student interview. And what I have to say is that there's really no significance to who interviews you, or no advantage or disadvantage. It's just the luck of the draw for the most part. So you shouldn't try to read into who's conducting your admissions interview. Rather, you should truly just prepare really well and do your research as we're discussing today. So let's talk a little bit about the preparation before we jump into some of the actual questions that go into an admissions interview. What you need to remember in your preparation are 4 parts, and we'll spend a good amount of time talking about each one of them. And those 4 parts are your story, your examples, your time, and yourself. When I say your story, what I mean is throughout your entire presentation, you've put a certain storyline. And I'm sorry, we have a question here. And yes, I will have some advice for you. Let me just finish my thought about the story, and then we'll answer your question live. So by your story, hopefully you can still see my screen because right now the Q&A is here. There you go. Your story is something that is a narrative about the kind of person you are, the kind of candidate you are, and the kind of student in that program that you will be. Your story has three important components. One is, where have you been so far? What have you accomplished, both as an individual, as a professional, as a member of the various communities that you play a role in? And then, where are you going? What's your future? And within that story, the MBA serves as a bridge. Why do you need an MBA? What will you gain from it? What will you bring to the class? You don't have to invent your story for your MBA admissions interview. It already exists in your application. This is why you got invited to the interview in the first place, because your story that you put on paper in your application appealed to the admissions committee and they deemed you worthy of being admitted to the class. But what you will want to do is refresh yourself on what that story was. Chances are that between the time you submitted your application and the time you receive your interview invitation, a few weeks, sometimes possibly even a couple of months may have passed. So you want to make sure that your story is really fresh in your mind. Before I go to talking about your examples, let's talk a little bit about the question that someone asked. So the question was, I'm a naturally shy person. Do you have any tips to help me overcome this in an admissions interview? And yes, this is not unusual. Not all of us are extroverts. Not all of us are gregarious and ready to talk about anything and everything, and especially ourselves. And ourselves, that's the topic of the MBA admissions interview. It's always all about you, right? So a few strategies that can help you. First of all, when you're naturally shy and you might have a tendency to get nervous, it's really, the preparation will be even more critical for you, because people who are naturally shy, if they have to wing it and sort of act without preparation, act ad hoc, that's usually not easy for them to do. So being ready to and prepared to face the interview is really important. We will talk about this later on, but I'll actually give you a preview of what's usually one of the first questions, that if you know that that's the first question, and it will be in some shape or form, and if you prepare and practice your answer, and we'll talk about what practicing your answers really means, you will be able to start the conversation on a really good note, and usually that energizes people. So the very first question in an MBA admissions interview almost always revolves around some shape or form of, tell me about yourself, right? It might be, walk me through your resume. It might be, tell me about your career to date. But in general, the person who's interviewing you will be asking you to give him or her a little bit of a snapshot of who you are. So answering this question really well is critical, because this is very often where candidates get tripped up. They ramble, they go into like very tangential parts of their candidacy. So having prepared in terms of deciding what you're going to say and practicing to make sure that you stay within, my advice is always, for that first question, no more than 3 to 4 minutes, maximum. 3 is better. Keeping it tight and crisp is best. Being able to decide what are the 3 or 4, at most 5 key messages that you're going to share in that story. You want the interviewer to hear that you're X, Y, and Z. You're an innovative, energetic leader who humbly leads, even when you don't have formal authority of the group that you're supposed to move forward with a project. So you have to truly know what you want your message to be, because that will set you up. That will give you the energy. Knowing that you've nailed that first question will actually warm you up for the interview. And then the only other thing I'm going to mention is, then we'll check to see what the other question is, and if we want to answer it now or later. The interviewers are very skilled. They have experience interviewing many different candidates, and many of these candidates are naturally shy. Like we said earlier, not all people, and even not all people who want to go to business school are alpha and type A and always ready to energetically talk about themselves. So they will typically read your body language. They will be able to see that perhaps you need a little bit of sort of breaking the ice. And they'll ensure at the beginning of the interview that it starts in a comfortable way. Interviewers are also naturally, they want you to succeed. You are not going to be subjected to an interview where someone is grilling you and trying to intimidate you or make things difficult for you. So you have very little to worry. If anything, I always advise candidates, be really excited. What a wonderful opportunity it is to be interviewed. So I hope this helped. Let's just very quickly, oh, that's a good question. So I will answer it live. The question is, how important is the interview in comparison to the other application parts? All right, great. We'll answer this now. What you have to keep in mind is that the other application parts are what got you the interview invite in the first place, right? If the rest of your application was not really strong, you wouldn't have gotten an interview invite. So I would almost think of these two things a little bit separately. Your application was strong enough, they liked you more than enough, they looked at you and they said, this person is worthy of being offered a seat in our class. Now let's see if all of our impressions about this person come through in the interview. So the interview is critically important once you get to the interview stage, because as I said earlier, there will be 2 or 3 people that are going to be invited at the most selected programs. That might vary as you move down in the rankings, but in the most selective programs, there'll be 2 or 3 people invited, sort of vying for the same spot in their program. And think about it this way: if you walk away from the interview and you didn't do well, and sometimes you'll know, but it's not 100% always the case, but if your interview doesn't go well, most likely the next step will be you'll either be denied or you'll be waitlisted at best if the interview was only so-so. And someone else who did extremely well on the interview will be the one eventually walking away with the offer. So the interview is an absolutely critical part of the process. MBA programs are selected for a reason. They value their culture, they value their ability to bring very high quality, very high caliber candidates into their school. So the interview is one of the most critical components in that it's live, it's unedited for the most part, it showcases the real you. So I hope this helped. All right, let's move on with the preparation and then we'll talk about some specific questions. You need to take stock and prepare your examples before the interview. And this is very often one of the hardest things for candidates to think about it, because there are literally dozens of possible questions that you might face in the interview. So they kind of freeze a little bit sometimes, and they very often come to me for interview prep and they say, but Petia, like, how will I know what they're going to ask me? Well, 2 things. A, for the most part, the interview questions or the types of interview questions that each program asks can be found online. Some schools will even tell you on their website. So again, do a little bit of research. But second of all, it's entirely possible to have a set of examples that with a little bit of massaging how you tell the story, because an example is an anecdote, a story, can answer a number of different questions, right? It's not that every question only has one possible answer or that one example only answers one possible question. So when you think about how most of the stories that you're going to want to tell as a candidate will fall into several categories: leadership, innovation, overcoming a challenge, and growth, your personal and professional growth. If you have several examples in each of these categories, that same example can be used to answer more than one question. And when we start going through the questions, we can play around with this a little bit and make sure that you know what I mean by that example. I just want to make sure that we stay on time, because quite fittingly, the next thing that goes into your preparation is your timing, and timing is critical. That's why we need to be tight and crisp here as well. You will know at the beginning of your interview what is the allotted time. Most interviews will include maybe about 30 minutes of back and forth with your interviewer, and then at the end, you will have an opportunity to ask questions yourself. So you need to be prepared for that. Whatever timeline you're given, you're going to have to make sure that you stay within it. The most critical part about this is to be able to make sure that each answer that you provide is no longer than, again, I always say, the rule of thumb for me is 2 to 3 minutes of you talking. Anything more than that starts to be too long. There are sometimes situations and certain questions that might warrant a slightly longer answer, but anything that goes about 5 minutes, you're saying too much, you're speaking too long, you're kind of like not staying on point. This is particularly critical, again, in the first question when you're asked, tell me about yourself, or tell me about your background, or walk me through your resume. You absolutely want to practice and make sure that you can do this in about 3, at most 4 minutes. Otherwise, that means that you're not staying on topic, you're not clear what your messaging is, and you're rambling, and your interview will not start on the right foot. All right, before we continue with timing, let me just see, we have another question. So an attendee is saying, I think that when I talk about my accomplishments, I sound arrogant. How can I praise myself without sounding bad? Ooh, that's a good one. All right, let's answer it. First of all, what you have to understand is that the interviewer and the admissions committee really do want to know about your accomplishments, right? So I know that that's sometimes hard, especially for certain cultures. I have been living and working in the United States for too many years to count. And for me, it was a little bit of an adjustment when I first came here to sort of be touting your accomplishments. But it's absolutely accepted and expected, especially in an admissions interview with a US school. And perhaps I should say that a lot of the advice that I'm giving here truly is to a large extent based on my experience working at an American school with many American schools, but the same is true of European and Asian programs. An MBA program will want to know about your accomplishments. So don't think that just because you're talking about your accomplishments, you sound arrogant. That shouldn't be the case at all. Now, in terms of your delivery, you could probably, the best thing that you could do is practice with a friend, with a coworker. If you're working with an admissions coach, practice with them to make sure that nothing in your delivery, in your choice of words, in how you talk about your own actions versus someone else's actions and versus the theme that's behind you, to make sure that nothing in your wording, in the way of the telling of the story, gives that whiff of arrogance. If you're asking this question already, and if you're worried that you sound this way, chances are you don't sound this way. Because usually the people who sound arrogant are people who don't have awareness of that. So I'm not particularly worried that you will sound arrogant, but practice with someone and ask them, hey, when I talk about what I achieved, what I accomplished, how I did this, how do I sound to you? Do I sound humble enough? That's gonna alleviate your concern. All right. So we talked about time, make sure to stay on time, take your cues from the interviewer if necessary. Back when I was interviewing literally hundreds of candidates at Babson, if I saw that a candidate had a tendency early on in the interview to go on and on and on, sometimes with the next question, I would tell them, this is the question, I want to know about X, Y, and Z, and your challenge is going to be to stay within 2 minutes. And if they were able to do it, great, but if they weren't, that was definitely not a great thing because I clearly told them what the expectation was and they still weren't able to be, I love to use the word crisp. And then the final part of the preparation is you yourself. Chances are this year and probably into spring, a lot of interviews are still going to be conducted in a virtual environment. So think about what we're doing right now. In a way, that's a little bit of an interview. I'm talking to you, you're asking me questions, I'm answering, right? So think about a few things. First of all, what's your setting? Is it professional enough? Not super distracting? You could actually argue that my background may not be ideal because hopefully no one is squinting and trying to figure out what's that painting behind her. But I like to show a little bit of personality. And sometimes it serves as a good conversation starter. Some people will recognize the painting and ask me how it came about. So there's nothing that's a major no-no about my background. You could choose to use a virtual background. Just make sure that it's not one of those that makes you look like a hologram. And every time you move, there's like this strange way. So just make sure that it's not distracting. Your appearance, make sure that you look professional. Put your absolutely best foot forward. Very often I would be asked, especially by male candidates, do I have to wear a suit? And the answer is not necessarily, but a shirt and a tie, maybe a blazer and a shirt are always a good idea. You can also kind of research a little bit, and in some instances, the interview invite might even tell you if there's a dress code. But generally, I personally tend to err on the side of dress for the job you want, right? You've probably heard that expression. So err on the side of not being overly casual. If you're going to visit campus and your interview is going to be on campus, then I absolutely suggest business attire. It's just a safe bet that you can absolutely never go wrong with. In terms of appearance, also make sure that this probably goes without saying, but I will say it anyway, that your hair is nicely, properly, professionally looking, that you're not wearing heavy makeup. Generally, anything that can be construed as not particularly professional does not have room on your face, on your jewelry, on interview day. So stick to an absolute minimum. Less is more. Just let your story be what truly excites the admissions committee rather than your appearance. All right, let's talk a little bit about some example questions, and then keep your questions coming in the chat if you want me to talk about any particular part of the questions themselves that are being asked. So we're going to go through about 3 sets of slides that will talk about example questions, because I want you to get a sense of what type of questions you're going to receive, because knowing that usually alleviates the anxiety and nervousness in people, kind of along the lines of that question that we had earlier. What happens if you're shy? So you will get some questions that are open-ended. The open-ended questions ask you to choose what story you tell, right? We already talked about tell me about yourself. And again, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to be prepared for that first question, which, like we said, can come in several different flavors. It could be walk me through your resume. It could be tell me about your career so far. But you, in the open-ended questions, usually not in the very beginning of the interview, but somewhere in the interview, they may get into kind of like more personal kinds of questions. What has been the most exciting trip you've ever taken? I used to ask questions about books candidates have read. I mean, reading is one of my favorite occupations. So very selfishly, as Dean of Graduate Admissions, I thought, I want to know what these candidates are reading. What is the book that has truly influenced them? In the open-ended questions, you'll also definitely face questions about your leadership and accomplishment, kind of along the lines of what the previous question from an attendee was. So the admissions committee will want to know about this. All MBA programs are looking to educate the business leaders who are going to have a positive impact on our society, on this planet. So they want to know about what your track record is already. That gives them assurance that you're the kind of person who, through the transformation an MBA program provides, will become an even stronger, more accomplished leader with an even greater impact as you continue to climb, whether it's the corporate ladder or whatever career you choose post MBA. All right, we have a question. Let's take a look. Oh, great question. So this person is asking, if I can choose between face-to-face interview and online interview, what is the better choice? This is a really good question. Well, there is probably a little bit of room for saying it's a personal preference in that there's a convenience component, right? It all depends. Do you have to jump through some really comprehensive logistics in order to attend your interview? Do you have to fly somewhere, go to another country? So it's not always as easy as making a choice. But if you truly have a choice and it's possible for you to go in person, I would say go in person. And the reason I'm saying this is twofold. it's easier for us as humans to connect in person. It's much easier than connecting via Zoom. We've all done an amazing job in the last year and a half of conducting our personal and professional lives, 75% on Zoom or whatever the percentage might be for you. But it's always easier to do it. And it's easier to read body language. It's easier to get a sense of the other person in front of you. But even more importantly, if the invitation to interview in person is to go on campus, and it may or may not be, because you might be invited to interview in person with an alum at a different location in the city or country where you live. But if you're going to be going to campus, what a wonderful opportunity for you to get a feel of campus, right? To meet with some students. You always have the opportunity to add different experiences to your interview. Again, back in my days leading admission at Babson, I always constructed the ability of candidates to add either coffee or tea with a current student, maybe attend a class. That was literally part of our strategy of being able to, for those who came to campus, and many of them traveled from really far away, to give them a really full experience, not simply interview them and say goodbye. So there's definitely advantages to choosing to interview in person. And the only other thing I'm going to add to this is, so I'm part of an organization called it's called AGAP, the Association of International Graduate Admission Consultants. It's there are only a few hundred consultants worldwide that are part of it, because the vetting process is really elaborate. We're vetted for integrity, for the quality of our work, our references are checked. But also as part of AGAP, we have a lot of access to the schools, right? So I'm constantly speaking with schools. They do webinars with us in summer to help us better understand what's new in their admission process, what may have changed. And as part of talking about this, we've been talking a lot about the interviews themselves and sort of how last year went, when pretty much all interviews were virtual, and what they're planning for this year. And the schools themselves will tell you that sometimes it's a little bit harder for them as well. Again, to read the body language, to see that someone is shy, right? And to help them along. So for both parties, in person definitely has advantages. Hopefully that answered your question. All right, let's keep thinking about what other types of questions you're going to face. You're most certainly going to get some questions that are going to relate to your career goals. Career goals is a huge and hugely important component of your application. Almost everyone is seeking to get an MBA with the goal of professional advancement. There's always more to the story than that. We all have this intellectual hunger, perhaps, or desire to surround ourselves with peers for a certain amount of time. But at the end, there's a career outcome that plays into the picture. And the schools want to make sure that they can deliver on your expectations for your career outcome. And that also you're the kind of person that, coupled with your MBA, will be able to accomplish what you set out to accomplish. So questions about career goals will definitely come about. They will ask you why. Product management, for example, is a very typical career that graduates of programs are looking for. They want to go and work for the Facebooks, Amazons, Netflixes of the world. So you will probably be asked, why are you interested in product management? And you need to be able to make a compelling case. A compelling case is being made by being very specific and formulating a hypothesis that can hold water, as the American expression goes. In other words, it can't just be a dream. You have to have some concrete evidence that you have what it takes, that the program that you're interviewing for does indeed have the resources to prepare people for that type of position and career, and that you've researched these resources and you can speak meaningfully about them. You will likely be asked, why do you want an MBA? You might be asked, why do you want it now? These are all questions that in some ways you've already faced through the application process. So you shouldn't necessarily answer them anew. You also shouldn't answer them differently than what you said in your application, because you don't want there to be major discrepancies between how you presented your rationale and your motivation in your application versus what you're saying in the interview, right? That would be one of those red flags that you don't want to face. They might ask you, what is your long-term goal as well? Long-term goals and their feasibility are a little less critical in my experience, simply because they will happen 3 to 5 years down the road. The school is not going to necessarily be responsible for making sure to deliver your long-term career vision. And also, the long-term career vision is what most often changes along the way. But it's still good for you to know and be able to paint a compelling picture. Again, what they're looking for is it realistic? Is it achievable? Do you have a plan? Do you have a plan B as well? That's actually something really important. And sometimes it's a question in the MBA interview. What if you can't secure that product management job at Amazon that you just told me you're aspiring to have? What will your next option be? So be able to, you need to be able to speak about that as well. And then finally, you're going to be asked some school-specific questions, and these are incredibly important, and I'll tell you why. Two things. Schools want to be wanted, right? I mean, they want to make sure that you're the kind of candidate who truly wants to see themselves on that campus, in that program. They also might be hedging their bets a little bit in that many candidates apply to more than one school. On average, when they're applying to top programs, very often they apply to 5 or 6. I actually just recently wrote an article for a publication about a candidate that I met in my work who applied to 18 programs. So you can Google my name and applicant applying to 18 different MBA programs, and you'll find the article. So schools know that candidates are sort of going after a number of programs, and they want to make sure that you're, okay, maybe if not their first choice, then at least one of their top choices, right? They don't want to waste and admit on someone who's only tangentially interested in the school and only applying just in case or as a backup option. So you're going to have to put some energy and some enthusiasm about answering the school specific questions well and in detail, but also answering them in a way that conveys your interest in the school. What's really important here, and what truly trips candidates very often, is if they really don't go below the surface. So I'll give you an example from my work at Babson. Obviously, Babson has been ranked as the #1. I'm also an alum, so I'm allowed to brag. It's been ranked as the #1 school for entrepreneurship in the world for, I think this year it was 27 years in a row. So naturally, when I would ask a candidate in an interview, why are you interested in Babson? Oh, well, it's the #1 school for entrepreneurship. Well, as you can imagine, that's not enough. That doesn't show any substantial interest. I mean, all you would have had to do to know this is to literally glance at the website. So schools want to see specifics. They want to see that you've done your due diligence, that you've read what they put out there, that you've spoken with current students and alumni. That's why the engagement with them is really important. So they're going to want to see something way more substantial than a superficial answer. So think about that and be prepared. How will an MBA from our school help you? Same thing. You want to be able to speak about specific components of the MBA program, something that's very relevant in the curriculum, something that's very relevant in the resources or in the student body or in the access that that particular program has to employers or to the geographic location of it. And ideally, it has to be more than one thing. It can be, oh, well, it will help me because X. You want to give a multi-layered, substantive answer in order to truly leave the kind of impression that schools are looking for. All right, we're coming to an end here. We answered some questions along the way, so I went a little bit longer than I thought I was going to go, but I do want to leave maybe about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, but just wanted to give you a few final words of advice. First of all, don't agonize over what you're going to be asked. Every single question in the MBA admissions interview is going to be about you or your interest in the school or what the school will do for you. So make sure that you recognize this as your opportunity to shine and let your light shine. Don't be afraid to talk about what really excites you, the experiences that have really shaped you. So make sure when you're choosing your examples, remember how we were talking about examples earlier, make sure that you choose ones that, yes, they showcase your accomplishment, but also that you can talk about them in an excited way, that there's something that's really meaningful to you. Because when that happens, when you're telling a story that's truly meaningful to you, that has been truly important in your life, the energy, the enthusiasm that you feel about that story will come through, and it will, I call it, light you up, right? So you definitely want to have the ability to truly talk about what makes you unique, what makes you exciting. And trust me, if you've gotten to the interview stage, there's a lot in your background that you should be proud of and that you can showcase. I didn't put this on a slide, but I'm going to mention it here. At the very end, when the school is done, the school representative or the alumni or the student is done with their questions, they will give you an opportunity to ask questions as well. And that's incredibly important. The worst thing that a candidate can do is to say, I don't have any questions. I'm good. I know everything. And it might be true that you've done your research and you know everything, but it's not a great way to end. So make sure that you have a couple of well-researched, well-prepared questions about something that truly interests you and something that's not easily, the answer to which is not easily found somewhere, because that will make a really bad impression, right? And then finally, and then I'm going to go to the Q&A because I'm seeing some questions pop in there. Make sure to send the thank you note. It's always in good form. I generally advise this after any kind of interview, whether it's work interview or you're doing an informational interview with someone. Informational interviews are a big part of the research that candidates do. They speak with current students, they speak with alumni. So sending a thank you note is absolutely a must, a professional good form. So don't forget to do that. I will move to the next slide that gives you my contact information in case you have follow-up questions and you want to get in touch with me. If you go on my website, My MBA Path, you will find an insights section where every week I publish a piece that has to do with the admission process and application advice to candidates, so that you can move through this very often excruciating hill climbing of the MBA application equipped with knowledge and the right insights. You can also sign up for my Sunday Insights on the website, but I will leave this here and I'm going to go to the Q&A now. So whatever questions you have, bring them. All right, so someone is asking, is it really bad if I have to call and reschedule my interview? Is it enough to just say I have to reschedule due to personal reasons? Oh boy, it's not ideal, but life does happen, right? I mean, someone throws a work meeting that's really important on your books, and it's not like you can always say, hey, listen, to your manager, I'm actually having my MBA admissions interview during that time, so can we not have this meeting? Obviously, that's not always possible, and personal reasons do occur and come up. My advice would be, unless it's something that you truly can't change, like the conflict, or unless this, whatever is making you think of changing your interview, unless it's really important, do everything in your power to actually stick to what you scheduled. If you have to reschedule, it's not a bad idea to provide a reason, simply because if the reason is a significant enough magnitude, it will give the person on the other end a sense of, okay, this person's wife is having a baby. That's a good enough reason to reschedule your interview, right? But it better be something that goes beyond a minor inconvenience. It's not a deal breaker. It's just a logistical challenge for an admissions office who is trying to juggle a schedule of hundreds of interviews, multiple interviewers. So as much as you can try not to inconvenience them, you're going to be in a better position.
Thank you very much, Petia. We've heard a lot of interesting things. At this point, I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box, but I have a question of my own.
Of course.
If you can share with us, without names, of course, or too many details, some examples of mistakes, the biggest mistakes that applicants make during their interviews. Just some examples of things that one should never do.
Well, maybe I could tell you, I almost started my Zoom session with one such mistake. I don't know if you saw at the very beginning that my screen tilted. I have something under my laptop and that something was a little shaky. So for a second, you probably saw sort of like I disappeared from view, but I can get away with it, right? Because I'm not being evaluated here by an MBA program. A couple of examples. Some of them have had to do with rambling and going on too long. I've had instances where I've literally counted, and on the question of tell me about yourself, a candidate would go past 10 minutes. When you think, I mean, first of all, it just shows lack of self-awareness, lack of preparation, even it's not intentional, but lack of respect for the interview process. So in some instances, I've actually had to cut the interviewee off and say, I'm sorry, but this answer is really too long. We only have 30 minutes. Let's try to be tighter. So that's my way of giving them an opportunity to get better. In one instance, and again, my screen tilting at the beginning reminded me of that. I had a candidate who I don't know how their laptop was positioned or what was happening, but half the time, like the screen kept shifting, and half the time I could only see like the forehead of the person, and he was nauseating. It was a little concerning almost, like what is going on? Like, are they okay? So make sure that you sort of are looking at what's happening and on screen and you're controlling your view. And then sometimes, and this is one of the hardest ones, it's there. I've had instances when it happens to me even to this day when I speak with candidates sometimes, sort of like personal grooming, if you wish, like someone with nails that are not nice and trimmed or too much jewelry. It's just generally not a very good idea to have that. It rarely leaves a good impression. It doesn't abide by professional standards in most countries nowadays. So these would be some examples.
Thank you very much. I think it was very helpful. I don't see any other questions, but as Petia said, if you have any other questions, you can always write her. You can check her website and her services. We are going to send you a recording of this webinar so you can check it again. I see that there was someone asking about e-certificate. We will not issue an e-certificate, but we hope that we were helpful today. Thank you once again, Petia.
Thank you, Nelly. It was wonderful to be able to speak about this, and I love the questions that the candidates asked. So best of luck to everyone who's climbing the hill this fall or next spring.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.